excited to welcome Dr. Judith Leavitt this morning. Dr. Leavitt received her bachelor's in social science from Antioch College, and then went on to a PhD in history at the University of Chicago. From there, she became a faculty member here at UW, where she's had a long and distinguished career as the Rupel Bascom and Ruth Blyer Professor of History of Medicine, History of Science, and Women's Studies. Her accomplishments are really too many to name, but for just to list a few here, she has numerous publications and books on the history of childbirth, women's health history, and Wisconsin public health. She served as the Associate Dean of Faculty at the School of Medicine and President of the American Association for the History of Medicine. She was awarded the Fulkert-Belzer Lifetime Achievement Award from the medical school and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association for the History of Medicine. So we are privileged to welcome today Dr. Leavitt.
Thank you very much. Oh, wait a minute. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be back here. I gave grand rounds, I can't even remember, at least 10 years ago, so I'm sure none of you were here. But my area is the history. Is this okay? I don't know why this is here. Just raise your hand if you can't hear me when I'm speaking, and I'll try to do something better. So my area, at least one of my areas of research, is the history of childbirth in America. And last time I was here, I gave a history of childbirth. And today I'm going to take a slightly different tack and look at the history of medical practice in Wisconsin. And still looking at some obstetrics practice as well. And let's see if this is working. I'm going to focus on three historical themes during my talk today. One is that gender roles, which we think of as being very rigid in the 19th century, and even somewhat today, were not as rigid as we previously thought. And I'm going to use rural medical practice as an example of that. And I think it's one of the prime examples of how men and women could go back and forth on their gender expectations. I'm going to also talk about the theme that the domestic environment was as important as medical theory in explaining what physicians did in their practices. And I'm going to tell you about that. And then also that the choice of the medical therapies that a physician would use was also influenced by the domestic environment. So it's really the interplay of the domestic and the medical that I think characterizes rural medicine. I'm going to use as an example of my thesis two Wisconsin physicians. The first is William Brisbane, who lived from 1806 to 1878. And the second is Horace Willard, who lived from 1825 to 1900. I got the title of my talk, A Worrying Profession, from William Brisbane's diary, in which he wrote, "I feel tired tonight from my medical business. It is a worrying profession indeed." And you'll see that his worries come partly from what he's doing medically and partly from what is happening around his household. I want to start with Laurel Ulrich's Midwife's Tale in terms of what she thought was important in understanding a midwife's practice, because I'm going to argue that many of the same things are important in describing a physician's practice. I hope some of you know this book. If you don't know it, you should become acquainted with it. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's really a terrific book. And in it, she argues that if you want to understand women's domestic medical practice, midwifery, but also midwives often do other things as well, you have to understand the whole context in which they lived. Their activities in the sick room reflected women's traditional roles in the garden, in the parlor, the church, in the domestic economy. So it was the social networks that a woman developed that actually helped form her medical practice. And in women's practice, and Laurel one who argues this now, but she was one of the first to really show that the public and private are completely melded in home-based healing practices in the past. Well, I'm finding that male physicians also were rooted in family and domestic life. That medical practice was not divorced from a man's life as a husband, father, and provider of his family. That the gender distinctions that we thought we understood in home-based practice of medicine were blurred in the 19th century. And actually, I think if you look at family practice in the rural setting today, you would find many of the same things. And it's in that blurring of social divisions that we can better understand medicine itself. That's one of the things I argue. Now, it's not to say that gender roles didn't apply at all. Women still did all the sewing. I don't have an example of a man doing sewing, although knitting, yes, but not sewing. Women did the daytime visiting and kept the social calendar. And men were breadwinners, so those distinctions still held. But the boundaries separating men's and women's experiences were certainly not rigid. And in Brisbane and Willard, we could see that they carried out domestic chores. They often crossed traditional gender lines. And it is in the home-based practice of medicine that we see exposed the intimate human interactions that cross gender lines. So first of all, let me just look at the two of them briefly and then discuss some of the issues. Both of them, Brisbane and Willard, were medical school graduates, which was not completely typical in this period. A lot of people practiced medicine having done just an apprenticeship with a physician, following him around and learning to practice that way. But these two did apprenticeships, but they also went to medical school and became MDs. When they were in Wisconsin, they were both members of the Wisconsin State Medical Society. They both migrated from the east to Wisconsin. They were both, interestingly, although maybe very typical of Wisconsin in this period, anti-slavery advocates. They were political activists. They scorned homeopathy, which was a sign of a good, regular medical professional. And they kept daily journals. And not only did they keep them, but their families after them kept them. And they're now in the State Historical Society, so people like me can look at them. It's not atypical that physicians would keep diaries of their practice. And many kept diaries that went well beyond their practice. But a lot of those are lost to us, so we're very grateful that these two have been kept. Okay, so first let's look at Brisbane himself. There's his photo. He was born in South Carolina in 1806. He was the son of a plantation owner and a slave owner. Got married. He was ordained as a Baptist minister, which does not mean he went to divinity school, but he practiced as a minister, both in South Carolina and Wisconsin when he got here. He served a medical preceptorship, as I already said. He graduated from the Medical College of South Carolina in 1837. When his father died, he emancipated all his slaves and personally brought them across to the north so that they could have their freedom more easily. He lived in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, he edited an anti-slavery paper, so you can see that his political sentiments were very clearly not typical of South Carolina in this period. And he moved to Wisconsin in 1853 with his wife and 4 children. They settled in Arena. He was the only doctor in town at the time he moved there. There were 400 people. But his practice was not enough to sustain his family, and this was true for most physicians in this period. He continued to preach. He ran a ferry. He served as a legislative clerk, town assessor, school district supervisor, and he farmed. His farm was raising corn. His wife, Anna, ultimately bore 10 children. Only 3 of them survived their teenage years. He died in Arena in 1878 when he was 72 years old. Just to remind you, Arena is just west of Wisconsin, west of Madison. The settlers in Arena in the middle of the 19th century were mostly farmers. The town had one store, a tavern, a lumber business, and a steam mill. But the railroad stopped there in 1850s. The railroad is very important to understanding the development of various Wisconsin towns. If the railroad stopped in your town, the town would prosper. If it didn't, it would languish. So Arena grew to a population of 2,000 by the time Brisbane died. This is a page of his, 2 pages actually, of his diary from January 1856. And you can see how historians need good eyes and patience to get through it all. But it's worth the struggle, I think, to do it, because you learn all sorts of things, some of which I'm going to tell you today. So to give you a sense of what his diary revealed, for a 6-month period in 1856, he saw 267 patients, or visited patients 267 times. It doesn't mean he had 267 patients. Monthly average of seeing 4 to 4.5 patients. 200 of the 267 he visited in their own homes, and the others he saw in his home, in his office in his home. He visited patients in Arena, Blue Mounds, Galena, Caledonia, Dover, Smithfield, Wyoming, Homer. You can see he moved around. And he was very worried about the weather, which I'll get into in a minute. Weather turns out to be so important to these people. Most of his practice was on women and children. Visited men only 42 times out of that 267 times. He attended, in that 6-month period, 9 women in childbirth. So his diary illustrates the concerns of 19th century rural doctors. It was home-based, either his own home or their patient's home. He combined medical therapy and bedside behavior, and the physicians who really thrived in this period had very good bedside behavior, otherwise they wouldn't have been called over and over again. He was well integrated into the community in terms of the church, in terms of the school district, and other of his activities. He was concerned about the weather. They were all very concerned about the weather and the condition of his horse and wagon, because if he couldn't get to the patients, he couldn't succeed. But he also spent a lot of time talking about his brothers and his sons' indiscretions, which worried him a lot. He talked a lot about his daughter's love letters, which he read, and he gave her Latin lessons as she grew. He worried about his wife's mental state, especially around menopause, when she seemed to be not liking him so much. He worried about the landings of the ferry boats, and in fact spent quite a bit of time recording whether they were on time or not on time. He worried about his corn production on his farm. He talked quite a bit at one point in the diary about the parlor wallpaper, because he wanted a house that could be welcoming to their friends and visitors. And so he worried about that as much as his wife did, and in fact he picked the pattern that they ultimately decided on. So his diary shows an intimate linking between the domestic and the medical, and I think we can't really understand the medical without seeing that other part. His medical business became, as he said, worrying when all that surrounded it was not in order. Domestic life made visiting patients hopelessly difficult at times. All right, so now I'm going to briefly look at Horace Willard, shown here. He was born in Oswego County, New York in 1825. His father was a stonemason. He taught public school, and then he apprenticed himself to a local physician. But he went further. He went to Geneva Medical College and graduated in 1849 in the same class as Elizabeth Blackwell, for those who might have a bell rung for that. She was the first woman to get a medical degree in this country, and he was a classmate and was very proud of her, very favorable to her, which was not true of a lot of the class, if you've read anything about that. He got married and moved to Ascalon in 1849. He also practiced in Watertown and Lake Mills. So he was just east of Madison. He also served on the County Board of Supervisors, spent a term in the state legislature, and he ultimately gave up the practice of medicine in 1866 and lived his life out as a businessman. He died at the age of 75. and it was Jefferson County, just east of Madison. So Aswan, when he came, had 600 people and 3 physicians. And it was vying with Madison to become the capital of the new state. But the railroad didn't stop there, and so Aswan went the way of many other communities and did not grow much further. Population was about 1,000 in 1860. To give you a sense of his medical practice, he was busier than Brisbane, but suffered great ups and downs of uncertain patient loads. He prescribed for and visited 438 patients in a 6-month period in 1852, a monthly average of 73. Was that me?
No.
Okay. And he visited also, as did Brisbane, most of the patients in their own homes, and mostly women and children. In that 6-month period, he attended 7 women in childbirth. Willard was very much practiced medicine in the heroic tradition, which was also fairly common in this period. And I'll just give you one example so you have a sense of it. He treated a 3-year-old boy for intestinal ailment in 1856. He gave purgative and rhubarb extract every 3 hours for 3 days, and then an emetic and blisters, which was the heroic. The therapy was heroic, and it was you had to be heroic as a patient to withstand it. But this patient recovered after 2 weeks in spite of Willard's treatments. But I wanted to give you this because when he gets to obstetrics, he has a very different notion of how to treat patients. I don't want to get to that later, so keep this in mind. So both Brisbane and Willard epitomized, I think, 19th century medical practice. They were rural and small town physicians. They were enmeshed in domestic and community sphere. They were public persons, representatives of a learned profession, but they were also family and community-oriented men whose personal satisfaction was caught up with their wives' activities, their children's achievements, and the town's social interactions. Family obligations helped define their mental preoccupation. So what I'm suggesting is that there was a combination of gendered roles in these men's lives. Family orientation was part and parcel of what it meant to be a physician. Domestic based, which was previously, and historians have since, associated with women and with midwives, they similarly infused the male physicians' lives. Brisbane and Willard both wove together their domestic experiences with their preconceptions and perceptions of their own medical practices. So in their careers, we see the interaction of the medical and the domestic. Medicine gave positive reinforcement to domestic skills that men learned from being at home and in their homes. The interaction sharpened their sensitivity and appreciation for the domestic tasks of their patients, therefore made interaction and conversation much easier. It was a two-way street. Being a good husband and father made a man a better doctor. Being a better doctor reverberated back home and made a man more aware of his own domestic arrangements. And Brisbane's diary certainly shows this very clearly. His visits to patients were combined with other activities, such as picking up a load of corn on his farm, taking his children with him, going with his wife to dinner at friends' houses. And some of what we know about Brisbane's practice we learned from his daughter, who also kept a diary. And she wrote, for example, one day, Mrs. Brodie was very sick last night and sent for father about the middle of the night. She is better now. She had the colic. Also from the daughter's diary, mother went this morning to see Mrs. Rockwell, as father was not here. She had a daughter. So Mrs. Dr. Brisbane also helped deliver babies. Brisbane himself was very involved with his children's education. As I said before, he delighted in the new wallpaper. He rose first in the house, lit the fire so the house would be warm when others got up. He made his own breakfast and he made his children's breakfast. This is his house, which doesn't look much to us today, but in fact was a stone imposing building. Now I want to spend just a touch of time on the weather because we don't think of that as part of physicians' concerns, and yet his diary was just filled with it, as was Martha Ballard's and midwife diaries of the same period. He was obsessed with it, and with road conditions, because obviously he had to travel on those roads. He put thermometers on all four sides of his house, which gives you a sense of what he was interested in. He rode 30 miles a day very often. And let me just give you a sense from this diary. In February, he wrote, "The mercury this morning was 22 degrees below zero at 8 o'clock, at zero most of the day. And tonight it is at 8:30 o'clock, 10 degrees below zero on the north side of the house, and 14 degrees below on the west side." You see, he's really paying attention to this because it matters to whether he can actually practice medicine. In June, he went to the farm, he paid 2 medical visits. The mosquitoes were terrible. "The mosquitoes are so severe that I am apprehensive we cannot do anything here. The family are very much dissatisfied. I never saw the like of them in my life. It is very disheartening indeed." And in July, it was 96 degrees on the shadiest part of the house and excessively oppressive. His family wanted to leave Arena at that point. But it was these confluence of weather and family situations, problems with the hired help, and unbearable heat brought Brisbane to call medicine a worrying profession. Brisbane also had financial difficulties, and this is very typical of 19th century physicians in general, rural and urban. One day, for example, in March of 1856, he attended a delivery, came home and found his hired worker demanding her wages. And he writes, "I was sorry not to have the money for her. It is so hard to make medical collection that I am left without the means of paying my hired people." And another day he wrote, he sent William, that's his son, out today to collect medical bills, but he did not get a cent. So it goes, and I am very much in want of money. And of course it was this lack of ability to make financial success out of a medical practice that drove him into other areas of preaching, of running the ferry one year, of becoming a school district superintendent and whatnot. Here he is with his political colleagues. When I mentioned something about his wife's menopause and her difficulty, she went with her children to school in Ohio, took them to school in Ohio, but she didn't come back. And he attributed that to the fact that she was a little deranged from her menopause. But he said finally, "I can't stand it any longer, I must see my wife." And he ups and leaves his medical practice, goes to Ohio, where they become reunited, and she returns home with him. So you can see that he schedules his medical business around his family concerns. His family concerns influence his medical business as well. Now, feminist biographers have suggested that women, more than men, make decisions and sacrifices on the basis of personal needs. It's certainly true of women in the public sphere, and I'm suggesting here that it is also true for men. This is a home office with the wallpaper. And I also want to suggest that home-based medical practice, maybe today too, is more susceptible to family dynamics than other professions. And so the gender lines that I'm suggesting are crossed here are not necessarily crossed by all men in all professions. When Brisbane was practicing medicine, his diary is full of family concerns, family's daughter's romantic entanglements, his wife's activities, the hired help, and whatnot. But when he was town assessor and justice of the peace, when he worked outside the home, his diary contains almost no references to family matters, including nothing about his daughter's romantic involvements, although they were ongoing, which we can tell from her diary. So this is just a stark example of how he abandoned intimate family connections when he temporarily left medicine, suggesting that medicine fostered particular sensitivity to domestic concerns and the need to influence them, which I just find as a fascinating way to show how rural physicians are embedded in their families and in their communities in a way that perhaps other professions, especially men working outside the home where they're not faced with those issues on a daily basis, would be. And you can see it in this drawing of a family, of a physician visit with the women around. So if we turn to Willard a minute, he also had enormous financial difficulties, which ultimately drove him out of medicine. but he billed for much more than he received. He got a maximum of 24% of his billed fees, and most of that was in kind, which is very hard to run your family life with that. In 1857, for example, he said, "Yesterday I went in the 7:30 train to Oconomowoc, and thence walked up to Summit to see a man who was owing me, but could get no money. Got back to the depot and returned by the 5:30 train." So he spent a whole day trying to collect this medical bill and was unsuccessful. His diary also shows his domestic connections very intimately. He was a bit of a romantic, Willard was, and he read romantic novels, which is something women did, but you don't see very many examples of men doing it. So you can see his language here. "Freely do I admit that my heart's affections center on these two beings, his wife and daughter, parts and parcels of myself." How many charms are thrown around the word home, the happy family circle, the ever-sacred hearth. And one evening he wrote, "I'm alone with my wife and baby, oh happy solitude. Visited one or two patients, the day has been warm and pleasant." You can see all parts of his life are in balance and happily so. But he too was obsessed with the weather. And he wrote, "A month of toil and care, of fearful anxiety, have had much to do and much mud to do it in. The snow is falling fast," he wrote on another day. "At first it fell still and was quite warm, and I started out for the country, visited my patients about 4 miles out. But the wind came up and a cold northeaster set in, and I was obliged to face the storm, which as severe as I had experienced during this winter." Another day, rain, rain, drizzle, drizzle, and no cessation. No sunshine, no dry wood, no good roads. This is a blue day, and this is even a bluer fellow, what is writing in this diary. The dark and gloomy feelings within accords well with the lowering clouds, mist and rain and mud without. Oh, who will deliver me from this living death? Have done no medical business. Now this, you can see the lack of balance in his life at that point. And I just remind you, people who traveled, this was probably a pretty luxurious way to travel in a carriage like that. They didn't all have carriages. So now I want to turn to his obstetrics practice. Willard kept a separate obstetrics diary from his regular medical diary, which Brisbane did not. He was very interested in obstetrics, even though he didn't see that many women in childbirth. And he wrote over and over again of the therapy that he did to women in childbirth in terms of his popularity with their patients and friends. And I just want to remind you that in this period, childbirth was not just home-based, but was a very social event. And the woman, when a woman went into labor, she would call her women together with her. And sometimes as many as 10 or 12 women would be around the birthing bed supporting and helping her. And into this very female environment would come a male physician. And some of them were very good at understanding how to behave in that situation, and others were not as good. But Willard attended the fourth birth of a woman in 1854, noting that her labor was very slow. She had excruciating pains, but no progression, and her friends became very much alarmed. He tried manual version, and he said, and I quote, "I did it with perfect success, though not without much hard work, for it was with the greatest effort that I could force the child back to introduce my hand." And he made the decision here to do manual version instead of using forceps, because he said, "The idea of instruments is horrible to friends and patients. With such a hand as I am blessed, turning is much the better way." So you can see he is keying in what he does in the birthing room to what the women around the birthing bed, and possibly the parturient herself, expressed. And I think obstetrics in this period, and really up to when women move to the hospital to have their babies, is very much a negotiation with kind of equal power, if not more power, on the women's side. So when he reflected on his obstetrics practice, he said, "I have neither bled nor given tartar emetic or any other sickening medicine." Remember how he treated that little boy earlier. "I have no doubt, but had I done so, labor would have been facilitated some. But whether my reputation would have been fairer is very questionable to my mind. The idea of being vomited at such a time is exceedingly repugnant to the patient and her friends. So he altered his medical therapy based on the wishes and needs of others. And you can see examples throughout this period of people doing what, physicians doing what Willard did here, that is altering their practice or worrying about their practice because of the opinions. But you can also see instances of physicians getting kicked out of the house because they try to do something that the birthing woman doesn't approve of, or that her friends don't approve of. So it was pretty evident how much control the women still had. And Willard understood that. And this is an example of when he attended a woman in her third delivery, which was very slow and difficult, and he showed that he understood these dynamics that I just talked about. And he said, I learned about this time from her friends that one of the female attendants had not been expected to be present, and that patient had a little antipathy toward her. Although she was the oldest one present, and the mother of 13 children, so that is, she had the most experience of the women, I sent her away. Nervous symptoms entirely subsided, pains became more regular, and the birth proceeded. So he keyed his activity to the social situation and understood it, and understood that the presence of a woman who the birthing woman didn't want with her slowed the situation. So physicians who were practicing in the homes of male and female patients needed to negotiate their treatment plans with the domestic environment, within the domestic environment. They had to develop these interpersonal familial skills. And it's an example of how domestic and medical worlds intertwined and supported each other. And there's no question that both sides of that were extremely important to successful practice of medicine in this period, the integration of the public and the private. Now, women, biographers of midwives and women physicians later on, women often seem to struggle to merge public and private demands. And we're pretty familiar with understanding that dynamic from a woman's professional career. But what I've argued here is that not gender alone made the private domestic sphere influential. What has been attributed to women in a somewhat essentialist way, I think, has in fact been situational, constructed by context and affecting both sexes. Indeed, the private parts of women's lives added stresses to the burdens of making public life, and still do. But I've demonstrated here that the same can be said for mid-19th century rural male doctors. So, if you want to know more about medicine in Wisconsin, you can look at this book, Wisconsin Medicine Historical Perspectives, which I edited with a colleague of mine, Ron Numbers, or my book on the history of childbirth, Brought to Bed, which is just out in its 30th anniversary edition. And so I always end with a baby. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Anyone with any questions tonight?
You can tell me if you think this is still true, that medicine allows you to cross gendered roles in ways that other professions may not. I know John Fry once, who was chair of the family practice department here, once told me a story of family practitioners in Wisconsin today in small towns who are very public with talking about their patients, yelling across the street, I heard that Mrs. Jones had a sciatica or something, which is not true in general, especially with HIPAA, but they are still enmeshed in the community in a way that the rural environment allows, and makes them much more connected to their patients in a way that a familiar, domestic almost way, family way, than was true for more urban doctors. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much for the talk, very interesting talk on that topic. But just one question, since you asked. Obstetrics, we're seeing fewer and fewer men going into our field.
I'm sorry, can you?
We're seeing fewer and fewer men going into the field of obstetrics and
women are always
gynecology.
fewer, yeah.
Due to various pressures, both be it from patients and other things. Do you have any thoughts on the future of that, if we should be recruiting men to our specialty? And I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that, in your historical perspective.
Well, historically, there have been fields that have been more friendly to women and other fields that have been more friendly to men. Obstetrics, historically, was friendly to the men, only the ones who really could understand the domestic environment and interact well with the women who were part of it. But once that moved to the hospital, that really wasn't the case anymore, and men thrived in obstetrics in the 20th century. So I don't have any problem with men in obstetrics at all, especially if they can interact well with the birthing woman and have what I think is still a kind of negotiation around childbirth and respect the birthing woman as well. No, I don't have any problem. I think women obstetricians can sometimes be more keyed in and other times not be more keyed into what the women are feeling. I wrote a paper once on the history of OB nurses, which was very interesting because nurses were caught in a way in early, let's say, hospitals in the 1930s and 1940s and into the 1950s when childbirth was still pretty new in the hospital and just becoming up to half of the American birth. And the nurses felt that they worked for the hospital and for the doctor, not for the birthing woman. And if you read birthing women's diaries in that period, they called the nurses sadistic. They're just terribly upset with how the nurses are treating them. And the nurses also are not relating, from their point of view, are not relating very well to the birthing woman or to the doctors who they fear in the hospital. They fear that they're going to lose their child. And so they feel really caught between two worlds and unable really to focus in both of them. And they're women, almost exclusively. So I don't think gender alone is what answers your question. I think it's more sensitivity, and which is true for all medical fields, not just obstetrics. But thanks for your question.
Thank you so much. That was just fascinating. I want to make a plug for having more and more men in obstetrics and gynecology because I think that the men that choose this field actually have a particular sensitivity to these issues of women in childbirth. So I just want to make that plug. I think if we lost half of the potential practicing physicians to other fields, it would actually be a detriment to our field. But my question is a little bit more about dual physician couples. And I'm wondering if there's anything in this sort of medical history world and literature that's paying any attention to that, because part of what seems like the issue here is these men who practice out of their home, when they had work outside of their home, it was somewhat separated from their domestic life. And when they were doing their medical practice in their home, they were more entwined with their domestic life. When you have two people in the couple busy in medicine, then the domestic life stressors, obligations, etc., I think it impact the couple in a unique way. And I'm just wondering if anybody in the world of medical history is paying any attention to that, because it's a huge, I think, contemporary issue.
Well, I certainly agree that it's today a very important issue. In the past, I'll say two things. One is that if a woman went into medicine, let's say in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, she couldn't be married, and she often wasn't, or at least felt that she couldn't be married. So if you look at women's physicians' lives in that period, they're extremely interesting, but they are feeling very much they don't want to be part of a heterosexual couple anyway. Many of them were, in fact, part of lesbian couples, whether they wrote explicitly about that or not. So later, when there are married women who marry a physician, they feel the stresses and the obligations and the worries that you just voiced. I think I don't know that historians have paid much attention to them, which is very interesting. Historians have paid attention to women before, in the earlier period, before they were married and before they were openly in a relationship, but not really that much until the modern period, when dual medical couples get examined a little bit more, and life choices and expectations are discussed more, but not so much by historians. It would be an interesting way to look at that transition from when women are finally able to have marriages with other physicians, and whether and how that has changed from then to today. I can't answer that. Very interesting.
Any other